Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, and today I am joined not by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. Today, I'm joined by a special guest. This is the first episode in a series I'm going to be doing this summer into the fall with folks who work in off-field roles in SEC baseball, because now more than ever, it takes a village to get wins on the field in the SEC, which gets stronger and stronger every season. So it takes more and more brain power. And so I want to shine a light on some of those folks and what they do and how they fit into what we see in the spring in the SEC. And my first guest in that series is Joe Dattoli, the Director of Player Development for Missouri Tigers. We're going to talk with him about his story, how he fits into the larger Mizzou framework, and a lot of other stuff along the way. I think it's going to be a fun conversation. But before we get to Joe, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. Joe, I appreciate you joining me today. It's nice to have a fellow Joe on the podcast. So first and foremost, that's important. But no, I appreciate you taking a little time for us today.
No, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Happy to have the opportunity to come on and talk a little bit about what I do.
First of all, were you a Joey when you were little?
You know, it was funny. It kind of floated back and forth between Joseph, Joey, Joe. I even got some Giuseppes with the last name being a little Italian there. So
yeah.
Got a little bit of everything growing up.
Yeah, I was a Joey until I still have some family that goes with Joey. I tell them they're grandfathered in, but at a certain point, I just went all in with Joe. So let's start with the broadest possible question here, Joe. I gave your job title there, Director of Player Development for Mizzou. In layman's terms, if somebody sits next to you on an airplane and goes, "What do you do?" Obviously, our audience knows a little more than your average just random person who would sit next to you on a plane. So maybe you don't have to do it totally elementary style, but tell us in layman's terms what it is that you do.
That's kind of a tough question because this role is really multifaceted. Most often, I'm handling the tech and the data that we collect here. So as you know, in baseball, we're getting a lot more technically integrated with everything from top down. We have a whole bunch of vendors and a whole bunch of things that we use to collect data, a whole bunch of information that's out there. So my main role is to make sure that we're collecting that information, we're storing it in ways that are easy to use and easy to understand, and really helping our coaches kind of sift through and decipher some of the tougher stuff that we have.
What was your what interested you in this kind of work? Was there like a little bit of a spark for you? And then what was your path to kind of get where you are now working in the SEC?
So the thing that really got me here was I wouldn't be here without Coach Jackson, first and foremost. So this path really started when I stopped playing for him. He offered me a spot when we were at Southern University. He offered me a spot to kind of get started in all this, try to bring some tech and what we could to that program. And we started off with just a few blast sensors here and there, ended up with a Rhapsody unit and try to build things from the ground up. So that was kind of my first real foray into all of this. Then over the years, it kind of just grew and grew and grew. Eventually, when he went to Memphis, he called me and asked if I wanted to go along with him. And now we're here at Missouri just a couple years later from that. So my path to the SEC kind of started with him, and I wouldn't be here without him.
Yeah, that's kind of a cool story. And I wanted to get a little bit on the early parts of that because, at Mizzou, you guys aren't really hurting for much of anything being an SEC program, right? But at Southern, when he tells you, hey, we want to do some of this stuff, and obviously we understand the differences in budget and what's available there, like where do you start when you're helping to cobble together a department like this when there's not necessarily a blank check for you to go out and just get whatever?
In reality, it's a great opportunity and a great place to start when you don't have so many choices. There's only so much you can actually do, so it simplifies a whole bunch for you. You can't go out and buy, or at least we didn't have the resources at the time there. You can't go out and get a TrackMan unit. You can't go out and get an entire motion capture system. The one thing that we could get was a few blast sensors. We eventually got a Rhapsody unit. We're very fortunate to have that. But we also couldn't get a lot of the developmental tools that, a lot of big universities and the stuff that we have here at Missouri. We just didn't have that opportunity to have some of those things. So one of the things that we ended up doing is we actually ended up making our own weighted bats using some liquid rubber, some Flex Seal, drilled a hole in an old metal bat that we had, poured some in, set it at a certain angle to get the center of gravity where it needed to be. And also, in order to make underload bats, we also took a giant drill and started drilling holes in the bat to try to take some weight off. So it's a great opportunity to be very creative with the resources that you do have, and trying to figure out just, you might not be able to get all the shiny tools or any of the shiny tools, but you can still make do with what you have. So as far as like developing at any level, as long as you have a desire, you can look to see what some programs have and like, okay, using the resources that I have, how can I get close enough to that? And that's kind of the philosophy we took at Southern, and it's something that we saw some real good success with.
I mean, look, if Flex Seal can seal the bottom of a boat with a screen door, like in that infomercial, certainly it can create like a weighted bat, So just
absolutely.
Incredible ingenuity there. That's really cool. So that's interesting to me too, because the type of players that Mizzou is recruiting to be in the SEC, I mean, they're coming up in an ecosystem where they've got that stuff in high school, like to a large degree, and on the showcase circuit, right? Mm-hmm. Less so at Southern. Some of those guys are on the showcase circuit, what have you, but less so. So how receptive were they to that? And did you have to deliver messages in a different way to that subset of players who maybe just hadn't been exposed to that? Certainly not at Southern, versus the guys at Mizzou who kind of step on campus and typically, I imagine, at least have some literacy with some of that stuff.
So it was 5 or 6 years ago I was there, and 5 or 6 years ago, kind of across the board, not a lot of kids had a lot of that in-depth information. So I think it would be pretty much the same anywhere. Now kids that all up and down Division I baseball, even other levels, D1 or D2, D3, NAIA, JUCOs, like everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, most kids have the opportunity to at least see a lot of that stuff, especially on Twitter with a lot of the free resources that are out there. They have the opportunity to at least get a little bit familiar with it. Maybe not the opportunity to throw on a Rapsto, throw on a TrackMan unit, throw with pitch logic or anything like that. But a lot of kids nowadays do have some sort of familiarity with it. So today's a little bit different with how we have to distill that information. But back then, even kids here, anywhere that when they didn't have that level of familiarity, we did have to put it in a lot more traditional terms and really start from like the ground level of what all that information meant. And it's a very unique setting when you have to, because I think about things very, very technically, very analytically, but it was great for me it forced me to learn how to speak to different types of people, right? People that aren't as analytical, people that aren't as technical, don't have the same background. Working with kids that don't have that familiarity, it kind of forces you to figure out how to speak to those types of kids. It forces you to learn how to coach in different avenues and different ways. So kids now, they do have some familiarity with it, like up and down the board. So nowadays you can be a little bit more technical, but still there are some kids that don't like and don't learn that way. So it's more of you have to just preach to your clientele. You can't treat Johnny over here the same way you treat Clark, right? So you just got to coach and teach how the player needs to be taught.
I imagine too, there's some of that on the staff. I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I have to imagine you distilling something down for Coach Jackson is a little bit different for Coach J, Tim Jamison, for those who don't know. Like, they just have different approaches to the game. They've been around, Coach J's been around forever. Garrett Jackson's a young guy in the game. So I imagine even on the coaching staff, there's a little bit of massaging for your part.
No, 100%. And that's kind of one of the cool parts about this job is you interact with so many different people. People like Coach J that has been around since the beginning of time. And people like Jose Carballo, Jabari Brown, and the rest of our staff that are kind of new and kind of young that have a little bit more familiarity with it. It's very fun to kind of adjust the messaging and adjust kind of the data that we give to them to meet their needs and to meet them where they're at. So yeah, like guys like Coach J, I don't give him the same information in the same way that I give to guys like Coach Jackson. It's really, we're delivering those reports with the focus on who our audience is, right? So Coach J, first met him actually last year at Memphis, And, from day one there to where we are today, like he's grown a whole bunch in his familiarity with this stuff. So even guys that have been around a long time are still learning new things each and every day, which is really cool to see.
Yeah. And that's to me, and this is just Joe Healy saying this. Now, I'm not putting words in your mouth this way, but for me, that's just good coaching, right? I mean, the guys who are willing to say like, look, I'm not totally comfortable with some of this stuff. Like, I don't know what all of this means, but like, hey man, I'm going to trust you to do your job because Coach Jackson brought you here for a reason and you know what you're talking about. And like, so I'm going to lean on what you say versus I think there's some subset of coaches, not so much now, but maybe when this stuff was first coming onto the scene, that were a little more like, what do you know? You've not coached it. You've not stood in the dugout and had to make these decisions. That has to make your job, I think, a little bit easier, having an old school coach be so receptive to stuff like that and trusting you to do your job.
No, 100%. And you see this with any industry that kind of goes through some sort of revolution as far as data and technology goes. Like, it's not just unique to baseball. It's not just unique to sports. It happens literally everywhere. So it would be really easy for somebody like Coach Jay with that much experience, or any other coach that's kind of similar to that, to say, you know what, I've been doing this for so long, I don't need any of this stuff. I can coach pretty well without it. But realizing that it's a tool not to replace you, it's a tool to help you do your job better. A lot of coaches caught on or jumped on board with that pretty early on. Coach Jay was one of those. And even though he wasn't in the game at the point where it was really starting to pick up, once he was able to, and once he had somebody next to him that was able to walk him through a lot of that stuff, like he started to pick it up really, really quick. And for him, one thing that he always says that is really, really cool is he says, like, it doesn't really change much of what he does, but it verifies a lot of the things that he thought, and it allows him to measure some of the things a lot more precise that the eye can just kind of give you a certain feel on. Now we can accurately and precisely measure certain things that he thought a long time ago, and a lot of pitching coaches that are very experienced thought a long time ago. But now it just gives them a concrete thing to point to say, you know what, this is actually true. Or maybe we were close, but it's actually X. So it's a really cool thing to see with them.
I want to move into some of the specific stuff you're doing on a day-to-day. But before that, I saw in your bio, you're working towards a PhD at Mizzou. What is kind of the focus of that, and how on point has your time management have to be to be able to do this job and also work on a PhD?
So time management does have to be pretty strict. There's not a lot of time for lollygagging or really any activities. So anytime that I'm not doing baseball specific work, I'm doing, stuff for my courses. And anytime that I have left over is automatically going to my wife. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no time for recreation. All that stuff is pretty neatly fit into the day. And so far I'm doing pretty well. But the thought with that is, like, I've always been a person that wants to grow always, maybe not in traditional ways. And this is definitely something that is a little outside the box for somebody in my position. But it's just something that I've always wanted to do. And being here at the University of Missouri, the statistics department that is here, it's just a perfect opportunity for me.
I have to imagine, given that those time constraints, your wife extremely patient. I would have to imagine.
She is fantastic. She is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Super supportive.
Yeah. Shout out to the great Mrs. Dattoli. So this time of year, we're kind of at the, probably not so much in the offices, but at least from the outside looking in, kind of a dead time in college baseball, right? Players aren't really on campus yet. Summer ball winding down, all that stuff. So, like, walk us through a little bit, without obviously giving away the state secrets here, but on days like today, like, what is Joe Dattoli doing in this role?
So days like today, people think of this as kind of a dead time, but players are still getting after it, right? They're either at home training or they're up here using some of our facilities, still working out, still doing what they need to do. But it's just, you're right, coaches aren't necessarily in the offices all the time. We're not having organized activities, right? So it kind of seems a little dead, but still players are getting after it. What I'm doing right now is a great time for a lot of my software development. So what we do here is we develop a lot of our own internal tools and make sure that we're pulling in a lot of the data, like pulling in a lot of the information well, storing it correctly, and staging it so we can actually put it in applications easily. Because one of the things that we really want to do here is, I don't want to, kind of going back to our previous conversation, I don't want to hand Coach Jay a raw CSV file of TrackMan information and say, go to town. right? We're not going to do that. So what we have to do is we have to pull in all that information with our internal systems that we have. We have to store that information, and we have to generate reports or put it in a dashboard that Coach Jay can actually use to distill and make decisions. So a lot of what is going on right now for me is building some of those internal tools. I was very fortunate. Some of our student managers, Trevor Madison, Peyton Sumter, that were here with Missouri for a long time, are going off and doing bigger and better things now with the Guardians and Diamondbacks. They built a lot of our internal systems that we're still using. Now I'm just kind of adding to what they've done and kind of pushing the ball forward for them. So right now it's a lot of software development time for me.
Tell us a little bit about how that would now let's spring forward to say a random March day, right? Middle of the week. Maybe you played a midweek game, maybe you didn't. Weekend series coming up in the SEC. What does kind of a game week look like for you?
So game weeks are very interesting. It is really dependent on what space and what availability we have, what a typical day looks like. There's not really a typical day. Some of the things that we do in the middle of the season, we don't do as much straight up development. We take care of some maintenance tasks here and there, but a lot of what we do is focused on winning games in season. That being generating scouting reports, doing advanced scouting for our opponents, doing some self-scouting, making sure we are doing everything that we can, doing some strategy optimizations and stuff like that, as well as making sure that our players are continuing to develop throughout the course of the year, and just making sure that we're not continuing to be stagnant and just being like, okay, we started game one with XYZ. We shouldn't still be at XYZ by the end of it. We should at least be getting a little bit better. Maybe not a whole bunch better, but we should at least be continuing to climb that mountain. So in the middle of the season, we don't do as much outright development, but we're still kind of pushing the ball forward in all aspects.
What would you say? So during the season, obviously the ultimate measure of success is wins and losses. Like, you're in this job to help the win column, right? Everybody in that building is that's the function, right? But let's say in the off season, or let's say, just the fall, how do you measure success with the players? Like, what are you looking at to where you can kind of hang your hat on, like, this was a good day, we saw X or Y or Z?
Yeah, it's really tough when you don't have the ability to play, outside competition as much as you do in the spring. We're playing like one or two fall games this fall. And outside of that, we're just playing each other. And it's really difficult to gauge like where your team is when you play yourself all the time. Right. So that's one of the challenges. And that's why we don't focus on, okay, how many hits did we get? What are our runs scored? Like, we focus on like the stuff and the underlying skills in the fall, and not necessarily the outright results of what's going on in the field. So as far as fall development, you want to track things that you can essentially do in a vacuum outside of games. And if you're continuing to progress in that and having benchmarks that but you don't necessarily have to play games to collect, then that's something that could be done and could be developed throughout the course of the fall. And if you have your goals, you set a program and you set a procedure to get that goal accomplished, and by the end of the fall, you either accomplish that goal or you're at least close, then you're going in the right direction. Like, it doesn't have to be very complicated. It doesn't have to be, we need to change a whole bunch of stuff. We need to do a complete mechanical overhaul. We need to completely redesign his arsenal. Like, if you just pick a couple things each year for a kid, as a freshman, as a sophomore, as a junior, if they don't get drafted, as a senior, like over the course of that 3 to 4 years period, if you're just accomplishing like a little bit each and every year, you're just getting just progressive growth.
Do you have any, and you don't have to be specific here in terms of giving us the player name, you can if you like, but do you have any success stories to share where a guy came back to you and said, hey, that really clicked for me, or hey, I see what you're saying now, like that makes sense to me, that has resulted in the player making a leap?
So I don't think we've been here long enough to have that success story. I'm sure Coach Jackson and Coach Jameson from their time have a much longer trajectory success story. But one of the success stories, as a staff from last year over at Memphis, was Dalton Fowler. He was a guy coming in off of a elbow injury. Coming into that year, struggled throwing strikes a whole bunch. And then after working with Coach Jay, just on mindset, being in an attack mindset, not being so negative when he's on the bump, and just making a few minor adjustments with the pitch arsenal and just making that incremental progress each and every week. By the end of the season, heck, at the beginning of the season, he was our ace, but at the end of the season, he was an absolute dude for us, and, drafted and is doing pretty well in pro ball right now. And just things have clicked for him just once he got with the right people for him, right? So it might not necessarily be something where, there's just all of a sudden there's this epiphany, right? There's this aha moment for a player. That's extremely, extremely rare for anyone to experience. But it's, going back to, it's all about just making incremental progress. And if you're making incremental progress as a player, like, you should be happy.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You said something there too, like a player getting with the right people. I think in your industry, I have to imagine it's a lot of very analytically minded folks, obviously, people who want to see proof and they think about things logically. Mm-hmm. But the reality is the same information can be delivered by two different people, and it can go over the player's head with one guy, and for whatever reason with the other guy, it just lands. And that's got to be both A, frustrating sometimes, but also B, rewarding when you actually do connect with a player and you can at the very least kind of see the light bulbs going off a little bit, or at least that, okay, they're absorbing it and getting it, if you will.
No, absolutely. There are always moments where you might not have this epiphany where one kid was struggling to make the 40-man roster, then all of a sudden one thing happened and all of a sudden he's your number one guy, right? Very, very seldom does that happen. But there are moments where guys do have that sort of, so that's what you mean by that, where something clicks, where, okay, we change the grip just slightly or give them one different cue and all of a sudden they throw the best slider they've ever had in their life. Like that kind of does exist. And you're right. Like, one piece of information for one guy will do something, and then for somebody else to do maybe the exact opposite, but it's the same cue, right? So you have to find the people that are right for you, not just the right people, right? Like, I wish everything was as straightforward as just putting numbers into a spreadsheet. But at the end of the day, like, this is a people business. Coach Jackson loves to say that all the time. I'm a very analytically focused person. I will always be that way, but I'm not dealing just with robots on the mound or in the batter's box. I'm dealing with people. I'm dealing with human beings. So I have to tailor, like, my message, the coach's messaging, all the data. I have to tailor that to who am I talking to right at this specific moment, and tailor that message and deliver the information in a way that hopefully they have a chance to understand.
Last thing here. I get asked this quite a bit. I'm sure you do too. When I run into young people in the industry, they ask me, how do I get, people who are writing for the student newspaper, they're like, how do I do what you do? I imagine similarly, this generation of young people who grew up reading, baseball prospectus and Fangraphs and watching, pitching ninja videos and all of that kind of stuff, are interested in doing what you do ultimately. What kind of advice have you either given or would you give if a young person came to you and said, how do I end up doing what you do?
It really depends on where you are and what you want to do. One of the best pieces of advice I got as a young student trying to do this is do the job before you get the job. So if you want to be a sports writer, there's a lot of free resources out there to just start writing, start posting online. There's a lot of free resources to post your writings. If you want to do sports analytics, Twitter's fantastic. There's a lot of people out there. This is a great time to just do your research project and post it on Twitter and talk about it a little bit. If you want to work for your college team, go ask your head coach and see if you have an opportunity, see if there's an opportunity to do something. I mean, like, one of the best things you could do is to do the thing you want to do before you have the chance to do it. So when the chance does come, you're ready for it. And, selfishly, I would love it if more students came over and said they wanted to work for Mizzou baseball. I'm very fortunate with the kids that we do have. They're absolutely fantastic, super knowledgeable, and super eager to learn and, keep moving us forward. But one of the best things you could do is just do what you want to do.
Yeah, I totally, first of all, not to make it about me, but totally agree, because I get asked, when I get asked, I tell people, go to the ballpark. And and I mean that mostly metaphorically, but just, what the best thing for my career was I just started covering games and I just started showing up. And then like the coaches would recognize me and started to, you start to build a relationship, right? And then you start to build relationships with other media members and SIDs and on and on and on and on. So I would echo what you're saying there. And also, if you were a Mizzou student that just heard the call, go find Joe Dattoli if you want to be involved in this. If there's one thing I know about college athletic departments is that there's always something that should be getting done that might not necessarily be getting done. They could always use extra sets of hands. So just, show up and offer some help. And most of the time you're going to be greeted with some level of interest there. So Joe, I appreciate you joining us today. Fantastic information. Love getting to hear a little bit about what you do for Mizzou baseball. So again, I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us.
No, absolutely. I appreciate it.
That's going to do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra at d1baseball.com. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. Thank you once again to Joe Dattoli for joining us. And thank you, the listener,